On the morning of January 8, 1815, more than 5,000 British soldiers stepped into an open field in Louisiana. These were not ordinary men. These were the veterans of the Peninsular War, men who had marched under Wellington himself through Spain and Portugal, men who had broken Napoleon's columns at Salamanca, at Vittoria, at Toulouse. The finest professional soldiers on the planet, drums beating, colors flying, bayonets fixed, moving with the precision of men who had won on the bloodiest fields in Europe. Within 60 minutes, over 2,000 of them were dead, dying, or captured. The Americans lost fewer than 70. That is not a typo. That is not patriotic exaggeration. That comes from British military records, from the after-action reports, from the regimental tallies, from the dispatches London received and then quietly buried. For every American who fell that morning, 30 to 40 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in 60 minutes, on a field barely 400 yards deep. But this was not just a battle. What was at stake on that field was the economic throat of a continent. The Mississippi River drained the entire American interior, fur from the northern territories, grain from the Ohio Valley, timber from Tennessee and Kentucky, cotton spreading across the deep South, all of it flowing south to New Orleans and out into the world. Whoever held New Orleans held the key to half a continent. Britain, fresh from burning Washington to the ground just months earlier, had assembled the largest invasion force ever sent to the Americas. This was not a border skirmish. This was an empire trying to strangle a nation in its cradle. If New Orleans fell, the young United States could be split in two. The Louisiana Purchase could unravel. The country that would one day become the most powerful on earth might never have grown into what it was meant to become. So here are the two questions that will drive this entire video. First, how did one of the most professional armies ever assembled walk into a slaughter so complete that their own government spent 2 centuries trying to erase it? And second, how did a general commanding pirates, freed slaves, and backwoods hunters pull off the most lopsided victory in the entire war? By the end of this video, you will have both answers. But the second answer, the one about what really happened to the men who made that victory possible, is the answer history never wanted you to find. Because some of those men were removed from the record so deliberately, so completely, that generations passed before anyone thought to ask about them. That story is coming. First, you need to understand what built the trap. By the summer of 1814, the War of 1812 was going as badly for the United States as a war could go. The conflict had started with confidence. The young republic looked north at British Canada and saw vulnerability. Britain was consumed by its war against Napoleon. Their attention, their treasury, their best soldiers, all of it pointed at Europe. This was the opening. The Americans took it. They invaded Canada and failed, spectacularly, repeatedly, humiliatingly. A series of bungled campaigns along the northern border exposed the United States Army as unprepared, undersupplied, and poorly led. And then came August 1814. A British force marched into Washington, the capital of the United States, and put it to the torch. The Capitol building, the president's mansion, not yet called the White House, gutted by flames. Government offices, the Library of Congress, all of it reduced to smoking ruins. President Madison fled the city. His wife Dolly saved a portrait of George Washington before the flames reached it, clutching the painting while the seat of American government burned behind her. For a nation barely 30 years old, still proving to the world that self-governance was not doomed to fail, the burning of Washington was a wound that went far deeper than any military defeat. It was humiliation written in ash. Then Britain received the gift it had been waiting for. Napoleon's defeat in Europe freed up tens of thousands of Peninsular War veterans. London made its decision. The target was New Orleans, not for glory, for economics. Seize the city, control the Mississippi, sever the American interior from the eastern seaboard. The man chosen to take it was Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law to Wellington, proven commander, a man who had earned his reputation leading bayonet charges on European battlefields. London expected a swift, decisive victory. Pakenham expected the same. The confidence in the British camp bordered on arrogance. Officers reportedly wagered on how quickly the campaign would end. They could not have been more wrong. The man chosen to stop Pakenham arrived in New Orleans in December 1814, gaunt from dysentery, with a bullet still lodged near his heart from a duel fought years earlier. His name was Andrew Jackson. His first act was to declare martial law over the entire city. Civilians, judges, merchants, everyone. No one exempt, no one leaving. Jackson looked at the terrain south of the city and made the decision of his life. 6 miles south of New Orleans ran the Rodriguez Canal, a dry drainage ditch, unremarkable, easily overlooked on any map. Jackson looked at it and saw a fortress. His engineers deepened it into a proper moat. Behind it, they piled the excavated earth into a rampart, a wall running from the Mississippi River on the left to impenetrable cypress swamp on the right. 8 artillery batteries, over 24 cannons loaded with grapeshot and canister. No way around it. No way to flank it. Any attacking force would be funneled into a narrowing corridor of open sugarcane fields with no cover, no trees, nowhere to hide. Every step forward would be a step deeper into overlapping fields of fire. Jackson had not built a defensive position. He had built a killing machine. And then he filled it with the most unlikely army ever assembled on American soil. United States Army regulars. Disciplined, but few. Tennessee and Kentucky militia. Frontier marksmen who had grown up with rifles. Men who could hit a target at 200 yards and had been doing it since boyhood. Louisiana militia units including 2 battalions of free men of color, one of the first times black soldiers fought in organized American military units. Choctaw warriors who knew every bayou and waterway south of the city. New Orleans aristocrats standing beside dock workers. Creole gentlemen beside men who barely spoke English. And then there were the pirates. Jean Lafitte, the smuggler king of Barataria Bay, had been offered a deal. Fight for America, receive a pardon. In return, Lafitte provided gunpowder, flints, and intelligence about every waterway the British might use. The pirate became the patriot. This coalition had no business working. These men shared almost nothing. Not language, not culture, not class, not legal status. But on the night of December 23rd, Jackson proved what he had built. With 2,100 men, outnumbered, moving in near total darkness, he launched a surprise raid straight into the British camp at Villeray Plantation, 9 miles south of the city. It was not a clean engagement. It was a savage melee fought in fog. Units lost formation within minutes. Men stabbed each other in the dark. The American schooner Carolina opened fire from the river, raining chaos into the British camp from the water. British casualties that night, 277 men. The raid did not destroy the British Army, but it stunned them. It halted their momentum. It bought Jackson the days he needed to finish the fortifications. Without that midnight attack, Pakenham's veterans might have marched straight into New Orleans before the defenses were complete. One desperate raid by an outnumbered general, launched into darkness with no guarantee of survival, may have been the single act that saved the city. Jackson did not build an army. He built a last line between a city and an empire. And standing on that line in the fog of December 23rd were the men history would later choose to forget, the free men of color. They were there that night. They would be there again on January 8th. Remember them, because what happened to them after the battle is one of the most deliberately buried stories in American military history. The night of January 7th slides into the early hours of January 8th, and Pakenham's plan begins coming apart before a single shot is fired. The plan required 2 things to happen simultaneously. On the east bank, the main assault. 5,300 veterans advancing in dense columns across the open cane fields to storm Jackson's line. On the west bank, a flanking force of 1,200 men crossing the Mississippi by night to seize the American artillery batteries, then turning those captured guns against Jackson's own position from behind. Both attacks had to strike before dawn. That timing is the keystone of the entire plan. And it is already gone. Thornton's river crossing goes wrong from the start. The boats are late. The Mississippi current is far stronger than expected, sweeping the vessels downstream. By the time his force is across, they are hours behind schedule and far south of their intended landing point. On the east bank, 5,300 men are already formed up in pre-dawn darkness. Fog clings to the cane fields like a burial shroud. Pakenham receives word that Thornton is not in position. No signal from the west bank. Nothing. He faces the choice that will define his legacy and end his life. Delay and wait for Thornton. Or attack now, trusting that 5,000 professional soldiers can push through whatever stands in front of them. He has already lost the element of surprise. Jackson's scouts have been tracking British movements for days. Every man on the American line is awake, armed, and waiting. Pakenham orders the advance. The signal rocket tears into the gray sky at approximately 6 in the morning. 5,300 British soldiers step forward into the open field. Dense columns, tight formations designed for shock, designed to punch through a defensive line with bayonet and mass. This is the formation that broke Napoleon's armies across a dozen battlefields. It is the formation that will destroy them here. From the American line, the fog thins like a curtain being drawn back. Shapes emerge, a dark mass shifting forward across the field. Then the redcoats become visible. Hundreds of yards of scarlet, shoulder to shoulder, drums beating the pace, officers on horseback with swords drawn. American battery commanders hold their fire. Jackson has given explicit orders. Wait. Let them come deep into the field. Do not fire until they are well inside optimal range. The silence from the American line is almost worse than what is coming. 300 yards, 200 yards. Then the order is given. The first batteries open up. 24 cannons fire canister and grape shot directly into the packed columns at close range. Canister does not wound. It erases. Each discharge sends a cloud of iron balls tearing through packed human formations at close range. Entire files of men simply vanish. The front ranks are shredded in an instant, but the columns keep coming. Because they are professionals, because they have orders, because the men behind them are pushing forward and there is nowhere else to go. Now the rifle fire begins. The Tennessee and Kentucky militia open up at ranges that stagger the British officers watching through the smoke. These men do not fire in synchronized European volleys. They pick targets. Officers on horseback go down first, then sergeants, then anyone carrying a regimental standard, then anyone still standing. The American line does not roar, it crackles. A continuous rolling fire, each shot aimed, each shot deliberate. These men had grown up in forests, hunting deer and turkey since boyhood, waiting motionless for a target to step into a clearing. The bright red coats of the British soldiers are the most visible targets they have ever aimed at. Consider what the soldiers in those columns are experiencing. They have survived Salamanca. They have survived Vittoria. They have faced Napoleon's best and held their line. And now the men around them are falling faster than they have ever seen men fall. Not in ones and twos, in groups, in entire sections swept away at once. The carnage concentrates in Major General Samuel Gibbs' column, the center-left assault aimed directly at the strongest section of Jackson's line. Gibbs rides forward to rally his men, sword raised, screaming for the column to advance. Men falling around him like scythed wheat. And then the column discovers the truth that will seal their fate. The scaling ladders are not there. The 44th Regiment had been tasked with carrying the fascines, bundles of sugarcane stalks to bridge the canal, and the wooden ladders needed to scale the parapet. Without them, the Rodriguez Canal is an uncrossable obstacle. In the smoke and chaos of the advance, the regiment failed. Some accounts say the men carrying the ladders were among the first killed by canister. Others say the ladders were left at the start line in the pre-dawn confusion. Either way, when the surviving British soldiers finally reach the canal, gasping through the carnage, they find a 6-foot ditch with a sheer mud wall behind it, and nothing to cross it with. They have marched 400 yards through hell to reach an obstacle they cannot pass. Gibbs is hit. He keeps riding. He is hit again. He falls from his horse into the mud, mortally wounded. His column begins to disintegrate. Some men press into the ditch, climbing over the bodies of those already fallen, trying to claw up the muddy parapet with bare hands. A few reach the top and are met with bayonets and point-blank fire. Most do not make it that far. On the American side of the wall, there is a mechanical rhythm to the killing. A Tennessee militiaman does not see faces through the smoke. He sees red shapes. He aims. He fires. He ducks. He reloads. He rises. He fires again. The cannons fire. The crews swab the barrels, reload, fire again. The sound never stops. It becomes the air itself. From the ditch below the parapet comes a sound worse than any gun. The screaming of wounded men being crushed beneath the weight of soldiers, still trying to advance over them. Pakenham sees all of it. He sees Gibbs fall. He sees the columns shatter and pool against the canal. He sees the assault dying. And so Wellington's brother-in-law does what brave commanders have done throughout history when everything collapses. He rides forward personally into the storm. He is hit in the arm, he keeps riding. He is hit in the knee. His horse collapses beneath him. An aide gets him onto another mount. Pakenham rises in the saddle, turns toward the disintegrating column, opens his mouth to shout an order. A blast of grape shot strikes him full in the spine. He is carried from the field, limp and barely conscious. He will die within minutes. The man who had orders from London to deliver a swift victory died in a muddy Louisiana cane field, thousands of miles from home, in a war that had already ended on paper 2 weeks before the first shot was fired. 4 miles south, Thornton's delayed force finally breaks through the West Bank defenses. The American batteries there fall into British hands. For one brief moment, the British have a foothold. Guns that could be turned against Jackson's own line. But on the East Bank, there is no stalemate left to break. There is only destruction. Major General John Lambert, now the senior British officer on the field, surveys the carnage with the eyes of a man who has not been inside the maelstrom. 2 generals down, columns shattered. The field carpeted with dead and wounded, not a single breach in the American line. Lambert does what Pakenham could not bring himself to do. He orders the retreat. He sends word across the river to Thornton, abandon the West Bank, fall back. The one British success of the entire morning surrendered voluntarily, because there is nothing left to exploit it with. The guns fall silent, not all at once. The cannons stop first. Then the rolling rifle fire stutters and fades as the targets disappear into the smoke, crawling backward, stumbling toward the distant tree line. And then the quiet arrives, a sudden ringing silence after 60 minutes of sustained gunfire. The kind of silence that feels wrong after what has just occurred. Then the moaning starts. From the first signal rocket to Lambert's retreat order, barely 60 minutes have passed. When the counting was done, the numbers defied belief. British casualties, between 2,000 and 2,600 total. 300 to 386 killed outright on the field. Over 1,200 wounded. More than 500 captured or missing. 3 generals, Pakenham killed. Gibbs mortally wounded and dying. Keane severely wounded and carried from the field. The entire British command structure on the East Bank decapitated in the span of minutes. American casualties, 7 to 13 killed outright. 30 to 52 wounded or missing. Total somewhere between 55 and 65 men. For every American who fell, 30 to 40 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in 60 minutes, on a field barely 400 yards deep. Pakenham's body presented a grim, practical problem for the officers who found him. How do you transport a dead general across the Atlantic in the age of sail? The answer was brutal pragmatism. His body was placed in a cask of rum, a common preservation method of the era, sealed and shipped home to Ireland. The brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington returned to his family, pickled in spirits. Every soldier who fell that morning fell after the war was already over. In the hours after the guns stopped, American soldiers climbed over the parapet and walked onto the field. They found hundreds of British wounded calling for water, calling for God, calling for their mothers. Some Americans wept at what they saw. Others climbed over the wall and shared their canteens with the men they had just been killing. Enemies of an hour ago kneeling in the same mud, united by the only force stronger than war, the simple human need to help a man who is suffering. The American line had held. Not at a single point along its mile-and-a-half length had the British found a breach. Then Jackson walked the line. He spoke to his men, and he did something that history chose to bury. He publicly praised the free men of color of the Louisiana militia, by name, before the assembled army. He said their country owed them a debt. He called out their courage, their discipline, their steadiness under fire. He placed their service on equal footing with every other unit that had stood on that parapet. Now here is what happened next. Within a generation, within the lifetime of men who had stood on that line, the contribution of the free men of color was almost entirely erased from the official historical record. Not gradually, not through the slow drift of collective forgetting. Deliberately, written out of the regimental histories, omitted from the commemorations, removed from the paintings. In some accounts of the battle, they simply do not appear, as if 2 full battalions of black soldiers had been invisible on a line where every man could be seen. These were men who had fought for a country that did not grant them full citizenship, who had stood in the same parapet, fired the same rifles, breathed the same smoke, and bled on the same ground as every other man on that line, who had done everything their country asked of them, and their country repaid them by pretending they were never there. Jackson praised them to their faces. America erased them behind his back. Remember that the next time someone tells you history is simply a record of what happened. History is a record of what someone decided to remember. And someone decided these men were not worth remembering. In New Orleans itself, the news of the victory arrived like a thunderclap. Church bells rang. Strangers embraced in the streets. But those who later traveled to the battlefield, who saw the field before the dead were buried, came home quieter than they left. The cane field had been transformed. British soldiers lay in windrows, literal rows where canister had swept through the columns at a stroke. The ditch of the Rodriguez Canal was piled with the fallen. Wounded men crawled slowly back toward the distant tree line, dragging shattered limbs through churned earth. The field was so thickly covered with red-coated dead that from a distance the ground itself appeared to have changed color. Smoke drifted in long, slow ribbons across the carnage, revealing it in pieces. The Americans on the parapet looked out at what they had done and could not speak. Many of them had never seen combat before this month. Some had been loading their weapons for the first time just weeks ago. They were hunters and farmers and dock workers and pirates, and they had just produced one of the most complete military destructions in the history of modern warfare. Across that field came the sound that was worse than any gun. Hundreds of voices, calling for water, calling for home. The battle was over. What remained was the silence, and the reckoning, and the question of who would be remembered for what had happened here. The news traveled slowly outward from Louisiana, as all news did in 1815. It reached Washington weeks later, arriving with brutal irony almost simultaneously with official word that the Treaty of Ghent had been ratified by the Senate in February of 1815. America learned it had won its greatest battle and ended its war in the same breath. The two pieces of news tangled together in the public mind, and for many Americans, the Battle of New Orleans became the victory that won the war, even though the war had technically already been over when the first shot was fired on January 8th. The battle that should not have needed to happen became the battle that defined a generation. For Andrew Jackson, it was a launch pad. The hero of Chalmette became the most famous man in America virtually overnight. He rode that fame through years of political warfare, accumulated power, and enemies in equal measure, and in 1828 was elected the 7th President of the United States. The general who had commanded freed slaves and outlaws and pirates and frontier hunters became the face of a new aggressive American democracy, for better and for worse. In Britain, the news arrived as a shock, and then it was swallowed by a far larger story already unfolding across the English Channel. Napoleon escaped from Elba in March 1815. The 100 Days began, and in June of that year, at a field in Belgium called Waterloo, many of the same regiments that had bled in Louisiana marched to glory against the French one final time. Waterloo did not just defeat Napoleon, it buried New Orleans. Think about what that means. The same soldiers, the same regiments, the men who had dragged themselves out of the Rodriguez Canal ditch and limped back to their ships. 5 months later, they were heroes at Waterloo. The greatest British military humiliation in the Americas was eclipsed by the greatest British military triumph in Europe, all within 5 months. Britain did not need to formally suppress the Battle of New Orleans. They simply had a better story to tell, and they told it. British military histories of the 19th century gave the battle cursory treatment at best. Casualty figures were quietly rounded down in official dispatches. The month-long campaign, the swamp marches, the brutal night battle at Villeret, the failed artillery bombardment, the disastrous assault of January 8th, compressed into a single embarrassing paragraph if it appeared at all. It was not a conspiracy. It was something more effective than a conspiracy. It was selective memory, the deliberate choice, made by governments, by historians, by the editors of regimental records, of what to celebrate and what to quietly set aside. And the fact that the battle occurred after the peace treaty was signed gave everyone on both sides a convenient excuse. If the war was already over on paper, did those men truly need to die? To the 2,000 men who fell on that field, the answer was obvious. To the free men of color who stood on that parapet and were later written out of the record, the answer was obvious. To the nation that survived because of what happened that morning, the answer was obvious. History is not buried by villains sitting in dark rooms deciding what to erase. History is buried by the accumulation of small choices. What to celebrate, what to minimize, what to allow a better story to overshadow, what to leave out of the painting, because it complicates the image. New Orleans was overshadowed by Waterloo. The free men of color were overshadowed by a version of America that was not ready to honor them. The men who died in that field were overshadowed by a peace treaty that made their deaths technically unnecessary. But here is what selective memory cannot erase. On the morning of January 8, 1815, more than 5,000 of the finest soldiers in the world walked into an open field in Louisiana. 60 minutes later, over 2,000 of them were gone. The Americans lost fewer than 70. The age of British ambition on the American mainland ended in a single morning. 2,000 souls, a nation's future, decided in 60 minutes. The empire that sent those men to Louisiana tried to make sure the world forgot what happened there. They almost succeeded. Britain had Waterloo to remember. America had Jackson and the myth of the frontier rifleman. But the men who actually stood on that parapet, all of them, including the ones the history books chose not to name, held the line. They held it when the professional army of the most powerful empire on earth was walking toward them across an open field. They held it until the guns stopped, and the smoke cleared, and the silence came. And what they held was not just a mile and a half of mud and cotton, it was the future of a country that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The earth along the Rodriguez Canal remembers what the history books tried to minimize. Not glory, not myth, not the clean story. A coalition of people who had nothing in common except a wall between them and an empire, who stood their ground and held, and some of them were erased for it. Now you know their story, and now you know why it was buried.